"Ma'am, this area is for brief attendees only," the young lieutenant said. He held his hand up, palm flat, a gesture more suited to halting traffic than addressing a fellow officer. Lieutenant Commander Amelia Wilson didn't react, at least not in any way he could register. She simply finished pouring a cup of coffee, her movements economical and steady. The sterile, windowless briefing room, a sensitive compartmented information facility, hummed with the quiet whir of projectors and air conditioning. A handful of other officers, Air Force colonels, Marine majors, Navy captains, were already finding their seats around the massive mahogany table, their conversations dropping to a murmur as they noticed the interaction. Amelia placed the small ceramic cup on the counter. "I am an attendee, Lieutenant," she replied, her voice even and low, carrying no hint of challenge. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. He was young, with the crisp uniform and overeager posture of someone who had memorized every regulation but understood none of them. He glanced at her green flight suit, not at the rank insignia on her collar or the gold wings stitched above her left pocket, but at her face, her hair tied back in a neat regulation bun. His eyes held the flat certainty of a man who had made an assumption and was now determined to see it through. "Spouses and administrative staff aren't cleared for this brief," he pressed on, his voice a little louder now, performing for the senior officers he imagined were silently applauding his diligence. "I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside." He hadn't even asked for her name. He just saw a woman by the coffee pot and his mind filled in the rest. Amelia finally turned to face him fully. She wasn't tall, but she had a way of occupying space that made her seem anchored to the floor. Her eyes, a calm, clear blue, met his. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said, still maddeningly polite. "The only misunderstanding, ma'am, is your presence in this SEX-IF." He gestured toward the secure door. "If you don't have the proper clearance, you are compromising this entire facility. Now I need to see your credentials." The demand was a pure power play, an escalation designed to humiliate. Everyone in this room had already been vetted and triple-checked by security at the main entrance. This was a personal audit, a public challenge. Amelia simply reached into the shoulder pocket of her flight suit and produced her common access card. She held it out to him. The lieutenant took it, his fingers brushing hers. His eyes scanned the card, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of confusion crossed his face. "LCDRA, Wilson," it read, plain as day, next to her photograph. "Lieutenant Commander, 04. He was an 02, a lieutenant junior grade, outranking him by 2 full pay grades. He should have stopped right there. He should have handed the card back with a stammered apology, his face burning with shame. He didn't. Instead, the certainty in his eyes hardened into suspicion. He held the card up to the light as if it might be a clever forgery. "This could be an admin error," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "A lot of records get mixed up during PCS season." He turned the card over, scrutinizing the magnetic strip and the chip, as if he possessed some arcane knowledge of their inner workings. "Lieutenant," Amelia said, her voice dropping a fraction of a degree, "my card is valid." "That remains to be seen," he retorted, his pride now fully committed to this disastrous course. He walked over to a small security terminal near the door, a secondary checkpoint rarely used unless there was a serious alert. A Marine gunnery sergeant standing guard by the entrance watched the exchange, his face an impassive mask, but his eyes followed the young lieutenant with a look of profound weariness. He had seen this movie before. "I'm going to need to run a full verification," the lieutenant announced to the room at large, as if he had uncovered a major security breach. "We can't be too careful." He slid Amelia's card into the terminal. The screen glowed and he began tapping at the keyboard, his movements unnecessarily sharp and loud in the quiet room. The other officers were now openly staring. An Air Force bird colonel, a woman with silver hair and an eagle on her shoulder, shook her head almost imperceptibly. A Navy captain sitting at the head of the table cleared his throat, a low rumble of disapproval. The social temperature of the room was plummeting. The lieutenant was either oblivious or didn't care. He was on a mission, a self-appointed guardian of protocol. "It says here you're naval aviation," he said, staring at the screen. He turned to look at her, a smirk playing on his lips. "Public affairs, I assume, or maybe a meteorologist. They issue flight suits to a lot of support personnel these days." The insult was precise, designed to diminish her. He wasn't just questioning her presence, he was questioning her profession, negating the very meaning of the uniform she wore. He was telling her, and everyone in the room, that even if she was an officer, she couldn't possibly be one of the ones who mattered. Not a pilot, not one of the tribe. Amelia's gaze drifted down for a moment, to the set of golden wings sewn onto the olive-drab fabric of her flight suit. They were slightly worn, the gold threads frayed at the edges from years of use, from the constant rubbing of parachute harnesses and survival vests. For an instant, the sterile briefing room disappeared. The low hum of the air conditioner became the roar of two General Electric F414 engines at full afterburner. The polished mahogany table became a canopy of plexiglass streaked with rain and salt spray. She wasn't standing on carpet. She was strapped into a NACE's ejection seat, feeling the violent, controlled crash as her FA-18 Super Hornet slammed onto the deck of the USS George H.W. Bush in the middle of a moonless night in the North Atlantic. The landing was a terrifying ballet of physics and faith, catching the third wire at over 150 miles per hour, decelerating so rapidly it felt like hitting a wall. Those wings weren't a decoration, they were a scar, a memory, a testament forged in darkness and fire, and the constant gut-wrenching fear that she had learned to master. They were earned. "Something wrong, Commander?" the lieutenant asked, his voice dripping with condescending concern. He had mistaken her momentary silence for weakness. Before she could answer, a man sitting halfway down the table leaned forward. He was a Marine colonel, his face a roadmap of sun and stress from decades of service. He had been squinting at Amelia since the confrontation began, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He'd seen her before but couldn't place her. Then his eyes locked onto the small, circular patch on her right shoulder, just below the American flag. It was a skull wearing a knight's helmet, the insignia of Strike Fighter Squadron 154, the Black Knights. And then it clicked. The colonel's blood ran cold. He remembered a dusty command tent in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. He remembered a desperate call for close air support, his platoon pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from a fortified ridge. He remembered the calm, steady voice that had come over the radio, the voice of the flight lead in the Super Hornet that had appeared out of the sun like a vengeful angel. "Gunslinger, this is Spectre 1. I have eyes on the target. Tell your boys to keep their heads down." He remembered the scream of the jet, the percussive, ground-shaking thump of the ordnance hitting the ridge with surgical precision, and then, the blessed silence. He looked at Amelia, really looked at her, and he knew. This wasn't some public affairs officer. This was Spectre 1. The Marine colonel's hand moved smoothly, almost invisibly, to the smartphone on the table in front of him. He shielded the screen with his other hand, his thumb a blur as he typed out a text message. It was a short, urgent burst of words addressed to the one person he knew could fix this unfolding disaster before it became a full-blown catastrophe. The recipient was Rear Admiral Vance's flag aide. The message was simple. "Sir, you need to get the Admiral down to the main briefing room. Now, a JG is trying to throw Spectre Wilson out." The phone vibrated almost instantly with a reply. "Who?" The colonel typed back. "The Spectre. VFA 154. The one from the Kandahar extraction. Get him here." A few miles away, in the hushed, wood-paneled office of the Commander, Naval Air Forces Atlantic, Rear Admiral Marcus Vance was reviewing a logistics report. His flag aide, a young, sharp-faced captain, stepped into the room, his phone held out like a critical dispatch. "Admiral," the aide said, his voice tight, "you need to see this." Vance took the phone, his brow furrowed in irritation at the interruption. He read the text exchange from the Marine colonel. His eyes widened slightly at the name. Spectre Wilson. It wasn't a name he heard, it was a name he felt, a name that carried the weight of after-action reports and award citations. "Wilson," Vance said, looking up at his aide. "Amelia Wilson is here." "Apparently, sir," the aide confirmed, "and a lieutenant junior grade is creating a procedural issue." Vance didn't need a more detailed explanation. He knew exactly what procedural issue meant when it involved a decorated female aviator and an overzealous junior officer. He tossed the phone back to his aide and stood up, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. He walked over to his own terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed that belied his age. He pulled up Amelia Wilson's service record. The screen lit up with a career that read like a recruiting poster. Distinguished Flying Cross, 8 air medals, over 3,000 flight hours, 912 carrier-arrested landings, more than 200 of them at night. Top Gun graduate, call sign Spectre. Flight lead for the mission that rescued a SEAL team under fire near Kandahar. Squadron weapons and tactics officer. Her most recent assignment was as an instructor, teaching the next generation of fighter pilots how to survive the most demanding environment on Earth. Vance stared at the screen for a long moment, a storm gathering in his eyes. He looked at her official photograph, the same calm, steady eyes he remembered from her last medal ceremony. He felt a surge of cold fury, followed by a deep, protective pride. "Get my cover," Vance said to his aide, his voice a low growl, "and tell the Master Chief he's coming with us." This wasn't just about correcting a lieutenant anymore. This was about defending the honor of one of his finest. Back in the briefing room, the lieutenant had reached the apex of his folly. He had logged out of the terminal, unable to find any flaw in her credentials but unwilling to admit defeat. He strode back toward Amelia, holding her SAAC card between his thumb and forefinger as if it were contaminated. "While your credentials appear to be in order for base access, Commander," he said, loading the title with as much sarcasm as he could muster, "your clearance for this specific briefing is not registering. It's likely an administrative oversight you'll need to take up with your command." He was inventing procedure as he went, digging his hole deeper with every word. "So for the last time, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you refuse, I'll have security escort you from the premises. We can also discuss the fraudulent wear of aviation insignia if you'd like to continue pushing this." The accusation hung in the air, toxic and unforgivable. Impersonating an officer was a crime. Fraudulent wear of insignia was a profound insult, a stain on one's honor. The room went utterly still. The hum of the electronics seemed to fade away. Even Amelia's unshakable composure finally fractured. It wasn't anger that flashed in her eyes, but a deep, weary pain. She had flown through thunderstorms, dodged surface-to-air missiles, and landed on a moving runway in the dead of night, all while wearing this uniform. And here, in a climate-controlled room surrounded by her peers, she was being told it was a costume. It was at that precise moment that the main doors to the briefing room swung open with a resounding thud. Every officer in the room, regardless of rank or service, shot to their feet. Standing in the doorway was Rear Admiral Vance, his 2-star flag glistening on his collar. Flanking him were his captain aide and the Fleet Master Chief, a man whose chest was so laden with ribbons it looked like a military history textbook. They didn't walk into the room. They occupied it, their collective presence shifting the center of gravity in the facility. The young lieutenant froze, his mouth half open, Amelia's ID card still clutched in his hand. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant certainty, crumbled into a canvas of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked like a man who had just realized the bear he was poking was, in fact, a nuclear submarine. Admiral Vance's eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with a glance. He saw the officers standing stiffly at their seats. He saw the terrified lieutenant, and he saw Lieutenant Commander Amelia Wilson, standing alone by the coffee station, looking more like she was facing a firing squad than attending a meeting. Vance ignored the lieutenant completely. He walked past him as if he were a piece of furniture. His gaze locked on Amelia. The Master Chief followed, his expression thunderous. Vance stopped directly in front of her, the stars on his shoulders gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The silence in the room was absolute, a palpable pressure. He didn't salute. Not yet. A small wry smile touched his lips. "Spectre," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I was wondering when you were going to grace us with your presence. It's been too long." The call sign, her aviation name, her warrior identity echoed in the stillness. It was a thunderclap. The young lieutenant flinched as if he'd been struck. The Marine colonel allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. Several other officers who had served in the air wings exchanged looks of dawning comprehension. They knew that name. They knew the stories. Vance then turned to address the entire room, his voice rising to a command tone. "For those of you who haven't had the privilege," he began, his eyes sweeping over the assembled officers before finally landing, like twin lasers on the petrified lieutenant, "allow me to introduce Lieutenant Commander Amelia Wilson. She has over 900 traps on a carrier deck which, for you Air Force and Marine folks, is like trying to land a fighter jet on a postage stamp, in a hurricane at night." A low chuckle went through the room, breaking the tension. She was the lead pilot on the strike package that took out the insurgent command and control bunker in the Korengal Valley, a mission that saved the lives of 17 Army Rangers. She was the pilot who, after a catastrophic engine failure and partial hydraulics loss, managed to bring her crippled Super Hornet back to the boat instead of ejecting, saving the Navy a $60 million aircraft. She did that with visibility at less than a quarter mile. The Distinguished Flying Cross she was awarded for that bit of airmanship is, in my opinion, the least we could do. With each sentence, the lieutenant seemed to shrink, his face draining of all color. He was no longer just wrong, he was catastrophically, historically wrong, and he was learning it in front of a room full of the most powerful people on the base. She has forgotten more about carrier aviation and strike tactics than most people will ever learn, Vance concluded, his voice ringing with authority. He turned back to face Amelia, his posture shifting from that of a commander to an officer greeting a respected peer. He brought his hand up in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. "Welcome to the brief, Commander," he said, his voice filled with genuine respect. "We need your expertise on the Iranian interdiction scenarios." Amelia's back straightened, The weariness in her eyes was replaced by a familiar fire. She returned the salute with equal precision, her movements crisp and sure. "Glad to be here, Admiral." The transfer of power was complete. The public vindication was absolute. Vance then let his gaze fall upon the lieutenant. The Admiral's voice dropped back to a low, chilling calm. "Lieutenant," he said, and the young man flinched. "Report to my office at 1500, with your commanding officer. You and I are going to have a detailed conversation about situational awareness, professionalism, and the United States Navy's core values of honor, courage, and commitment, which you seem to have misplaced." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet fury was far more terrifying. He plucked the CXC from the lieutenant's numb fingers and handed it back to Amelia. "Admiral," Amelia said, stepping forward slightly. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil she must have felt. With all due respect, the lieutenant was attempting to follow security protocol. His execution was flawed, but the principle of vigilance is sound. The standard is the standard for a reason. She looked at the young man not with anger but with a kind of detached disappointment. The standard just has to be applied fairly, to everyone every time, regardless of what you think you see. It was a masterclass in grace. She wasn't asking for an apology or for retribution. She was reinforcing the ideal that the institution was more important than any single person's ego, including her own. She was teaching, as she spoke of standards, of the unblinking application of rules. Another memory flashed behind her eyes, brighter and more vivid than the last. She was in the cockpit again, this time not landing, but launching. The catapult officer on the deck below gave the signal. The world dissolved into a blur of controlled violence. In less than 2 seconds, her aircraft went from 0 to 165 miles per hour. The G-forces were immense, crushing her into her seat, but her hands were steady on the controls, her eyes scanning the instruments, her mind already a dozen steps ahead, focused on the mission. That was the standard. Absolute perfection, every single time, because lives depended on it. Those golden wings weren't just about skill, they were about a sacred trust, a trust the young lieutenant had failed to see. The fallout was swift, but not in the way most expected. Lieutenant Peterson was not discharged, but he was removed from his position at the command and reassigned to a logistics billet, where his capacity for embarrassing the Navy would be significantly curtailed. Admiral Vance mandated a command-wide refresher on equal opportunity and leadership training, using a carefully anonymized version of the incident as a case study in unconscious bias. He also instituted a new mentorship initiative, pairing junior officers with senior enlisted and seasoned mid-career officers like Amelia, hoping to build the kind of understanding that regulations alone could not. A few weeks later, Amelia was in the base commissary, picking up groceries after a long day in the simulator. She heard a tentative voice behind her. "Commander Wilson?" She turned to see Lieutenant Peterson. He was in civilian clothes, and without the starched uniform and rigid posture, he looked younger and smaller. His face was pale, and his eyes were fixed on the floor. "Lieutenant," she acknowledged, her tone neutral. He finally looked up and she saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "Ma'am, Commander, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. There's no excuse for my behavior in the briefing room. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and completely out of line. I was wrong." He said the words like a penance, something he had been practicing. "Thank you for what you said to the Admiral. You didn't have to do that." Amelia studied him for a moment. She saw the shattered pride but also a flicker of something new, humility. "We all make mistakes, Lieutenant," she said, her voice softening. "The important thing is what we do after. Learn from it. The next time you see a uniform, see the sailor, not your assumption of them. See the rank they earned, the insignia they bled for." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I will, ma'am. I promise." She gave him a small, tight smile. "Good. Now go buy your groceries. And Lieutenant," he looked up, "tuck your shirt in." A hint of the old specter was back in her eyes. He looked down, embarrassed to see his t-shirt untucked, and quickly fixed it. It was a small, simple course correction, a seed of mentorship, planted in the unlikely soil of a public humiliation. The story of Lieutenant Commander Spectre Wilson is a powerful reminder that heroes wear many faces, and valor isn't always found in the cockpit of a fighter jet. Sometimes, it's found in the quiet dignity of standing your ground. If you were inspired by her story, please like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to She Chose Valor for more incredible stories honoring our women in uniform.